On Wednesday, U.S. President Donald Trump stunned global markets by unveiling a sweeping set of tariffs under what he boldly labeled Liberation Day. This move has sent shockwaves across international financial systems, rattling investors and casting a dark cloud of uncertainty. Trump's motivations behind this dramatic economic shift remain ambiguous. In his announcement, he cited several reasons: revitalizing American manufacturing, shrinking the trade deficit, and even addressing the national debt. But none of these explanations seem to fully align with the reality of the ground. In fact, the immediate impact of these tariffs appear to be a looming recession rather than an economic renaissance that Trump seems to envision. Because of this mismatch between rhetoric and result, some analysts and economists have proposed a more strategic, perhaps radical interpretation of what's going on. According to them, the tariffs might not be the end goal at all, but rather the first step in a much grander strategy. A deeper look reveals a possible plan to intentionally devalue the U.S. dollar and orchestrate an unprecedented restructuring of America's colossal national debt. At first glance, that might sound like a conspiracy theory, but the idea has some backing from serious academic work. The chair of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors recently published a paper titled A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System, where he laid out a blueprint that looks remarkably like what's unfolding now. The plan, which some have called the Mar-a-Lago Accord in a nod to the famous 1985 Plaza Accord, suggests a coordinated international effort to address America's financial imbalances, not just through tariffs or interest rate manipulation, but through global diplomacy, debt rescheduling, and currency realignment. To understand this ambitious vision, you need to grasp the magnitude of the U.S. debt. At present, America's national debt to GDP ratio is hovering around 123%, a level historically associated with severe fiscal strain. In 2024 alone, the federal government ran a deficit equivalent to 6.4% of GDP, the highest in the developed world aside from Israel. These figures indicate that the U.S. is teetering on the edge of a full-blown debt spiral. The government is increasingly borrowing just to cover the interest of existing debt, and each new loan adds to the burden, making future interest payments even more sustainable. There's already daunting situation becomes even more precarious when you consider the impact of a potential dollar devaluation, a move both Moran and Trump have hinted at. Moran's paper floats the idea that addressing America's trade imbalances might require a devaluation of the dollar by as much as 15%. And Trump himself told Bloomberg last July that the strong dollar represents a big currency problem for the U.S. economy. Why does the strength of the dollar matter? In simple terms, a strong dollar makes an American export more expensive for foreign buyers, while making imported goods cheaper for Americans. This dynamic exacerbates the U.S. trade deficit and, according to Trump's economic team, contributes to the decline of domestic manufacturing. By weakening the dollar, they argue American goods will become more competitive abroad, potentially jumpstarting the nation's industrial base. But there's a catch. Devaluing the dollar could have severe consequences. First, it would likely trigger a sell-off of U.S. government bonds, also known as treasuries, because the real value of the interest payments and final returns would be eroded. Investors don't like being paid back in devalued currency. Second, such a move could seriously undermine the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. Today, the dollar enjoys a unique place in the global financial system. Central banks around the world hold massive reserves of dollars, largely because the currency is considered stable, reliable, and safe. U.S. treasuries are on the go-to debt instruments for countries and institutions seeking low-risk investments. If that trust is lost, if investors believe the U.S. might intentionally devalue its currencies or fail to honor its debt obligations, then the entire system could be thrown into disarray. Demand for treasuries could evaporate, borrowing costs would skyrocket, and the U.S. government's ability to finance its operations would be severely constrained. So how does Moran propose to square this circle? Enter the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord. In essence, he suggests a multilateral agreement where American key trading partners would voluntarily strengthen their own currencies, thereby achieving a de facto devaluation of the dollar without the U.S. needing to take direct action. This strategy is modeled after the 1985 Plaza Accord, where the Reagan administration successfully persuaded Japan, West Germany, and other allies to appreciate their currencies to correct trade imbalances. But Moran's proposal goes much further. Not only would America's trading partners need to adjust their own currencies, but they would also be asked to accept a rescheduling of the U.S. debt. What does that mean in practice? Well, most U.S. treasuries have fixed maturities, ranging from a few months to 30 years. When a treasury bond matures, the government repays its face value to the investors. Moran wants to delay these repayments potentially by issuing so-called century bonds, which wouldn't mature for 100 years, or even perpetual bonds, which never mature at all and only pay interest indefinitely. This would massively ease the burden of the U.S. Treasury, giving the government decades or even an entire century to settle its obligations. But it's a terrible deal for American creditors. They'd be locked into long-term commitments with a little chance of recovering returning their principal anytime soon. So why would any country agree to this? Moran's answer is a blend of carrot and stick. He argues that America's allies essentially owe it to the U.S. for the protection provided by its military umbrella. If that argument doesn't win them over, then there are the tools the U.S. can use to exert pressure. First, there's the threat of more tariffs, economic punishment for those who don't play ball. Second, there's the risk of losing American defense support, something that's already been put on the table in recent political debates. Third, the U.S. could use central banking tools to influence or coerce compliance. Some analysts see the recent wave of tariffs and Trump's threats to reduce America's military commitments abroad as part of a larger campaign to set the stage for this Mar-a-Lago Accord. Trump's administration has shown a willingness to clash with the traditional allies and push aggressive economic policies that align with Moran's vision. In fact, last year, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent proposed that NATO members who weren't meeting their defense spending targets should be required to purchase 50-year military bonds from the U.S., another creative way to secure long-term funding. But the big question remains, is this plan realistic? There are serious challenges. The original Plaza Accord worked in part because America's main trading partners were also its closest allies. That's not the case today. China is now America's largest trading partner and one of the biggest holders of U.S. debt. And given the current state of U.S. China relations, it's hard to imagine Beijing agreeing to a deal that benefits Washington at its own expense. Even European countries might bolt. Trump's previous threats to withdraw support from NATO have eroded trust, and European leaders no longer view the American security umbrella as unshakable. Even if a few allies were persuaded to sign on, it might not be enough. Approximately 75% of all U.S. treasuries are held domestically. A dollar devaluation would still impact those investors, including pension funds, mutual funds, and individual savers. The political fallout could be enormous. Ultimately, while there's clearly a well-thought-out intellectual framework for this grand strategy, it's far from clear whether the Trump administration is actually following that playbook. The tariff threats, the bombastic statements, and they all might just be reactive rather than part of a carefully orchestrated plan. There's a real possibility that policy is being shaped by instinct and ideology rather than long-term economic chess. In any case, these developments have introduced a tremendous amount of uncertainty into the next global economy. Investors, policymakers, and citizens alike are left wondering what comes next and how they can protect themselves in an environment that feels increasingly unstable.